Why are you doing this interview?
I think it's important for the agency perspective to be included, to get as much of some of the history, the background, what it is that we're doing in response to some of these fatalities, and for the public to understand that we are taking this very seriously. We are responding. We can't always be super transparent with all of the information because of certain confidentiality laws and also the way our process works, but we want to make sure that anything we can get out to the public, that we're getting out to the public as quickly and as transparently as we can.
There have been 3 high-profile murders in a matter of months, children known to DCS. How did we get here?
Well, the 3 cases are actually incredibly different. I know they all happened right around the same time, but our response to them and how we are responding to them is going to be different. Our involvement with the families are different. One of the children was in our custody. One of the children was in the custody of someone else, but placed in one of our homes. And then the third was a case that we had investigated. We knew the child, but they weren't in our custody. So the way that we look into the cases and the way that we make changes is going to be different for all 3 of those.
So let's start and talk about each individual case, and then we can kind of talk about more of the history and where do we go from here. But let's talk about Rebecca Baptiste.
Okay.
Why couldn't the department do more to protect Rebecca Baptiste?
So the case is very complicated. We've had a 10-year history with the family. The child was in out-of-home care, as some of the information we've released has shown. There were a lot of systems that were involved with the family. The department is a statutory agency, and so we have the authority granted to us in statute to act. So we can only take a report at the hotline if the report meets report criteria. So it has to be on a parent, guardian, or custodian. The alleged victim has to be a child, and the report has to allege either abuse or neglect. In order for it to meet the statutory criteria for abuse or neglect, there has to either have been actual physical harm to the child, or if it's neglect, it has to be that the child is at a substantial risk of harm based on the parent's act or failure to act. So some of the calls that we received don't meet that threshold, right? And so we don't have the authority to go out and investigate without meeting the statutory burden. When we go out to work with a family, we have a SAFE model that we use. It's a national model adapted for Arizona. We worked with a national organization to create it. It's in statute that we have to use it. And so it's guided decision making for the field about when we take custody of a child, when we don't take custody of a child. If we don't take custody of a child, we can offer in-home services to the family, but they're voluntary. So sometimes a family may decline to participate, but if we don't have enough to rise to the level of removal, which is a high burden, and it should be, right, because we're taking the custody of someone's child from them, then we don't have the authority to act. Something that's being talked about a lot in Arizona is DCS is designed as a child protection agency, right? We're there for safety. So if what comes to the hotline or if what we're seeing in the home doesn't rise to the level of an unsafe child, but there's concerns for the family, some states have kind of like a third or a second option, right? It's not DCS, but it's someone who can intervene with the family and help. And so some groups like Protect Child Abuse Arizona are working to create a network of family resource centers where families who there are some concerns in the family, but they don't rise to a child safety protection response can go. That way they don't become a child safety protection response in the future.
What went wrong in Rebecca Baptiste's case? And could the department have done more?
So what the department does in response to these high-profile fatalities is we do what's called a serious critical incident review. So what those do is they look back through the case. We have people looking, they're reviewing the entire case file, they're listening to every hotline call, and they discover what we call learning points. So I can look at the history in this case, and I can tell you, I have some questions, right, about things that have happened. And that's kind of what the team does. So they look at points where they are curious how decisions were made. Those learning points are presented to a multidisciplinary team, which is in statute. Senator Champ passed a bill 2 years ago that added outside people to this team. So it's not just the department, it includes a law enforcement officer, it includes a child's attorney, it includes a social worker, it includes a pediatrician. And so they present these learning points to the MDT, and then they will do what's called debriefings on them. So we can look at something, I can look at something that happened in the case and say that doesn't make any sense to me. The decision made sense to the worker at the time, so I need to understand what was influencing that decision and how they came to the conclusions that they did. And then that's how we make the change.
What questions do you have in Rebecca's case right now?
Sure. And I don't want to disrupt the integrity of this review process, but I'll tell you one that I think is going to come out. So we investigate some cases jointly with law enforcement. So anything that comes in and is coded criminal conduct, that means if true, it would be a felony child abuse, or any type of sex crime. And so those are investigated jointly with law enforcement by a special unit in DCS called the Office of Child Welfare Investigations. So they are highly trained investigators, and they do what's called joint investigation protocol. None of these reports were coded criminal conduct, and there are a couple with hindsight bias looking at them, I think maybe should have been. So that's something that we would explore. And instead of saying, well, this wasn't coded criminal conduct, how could you have done that? We understand, or we seek to understand how the decision was made. And then if we need to update a policy, if we need to update a tool, we have tools we use for all of this, we make the change based on that, rather than me just saying, here's where you went wrong, you fix it, right? Because that's not going to get to the root of the problem.
Kind of in layman's terms, what does that mean? So is it fair to say you're looking at this and seeing that, because there's a disconnect, right? You've got the school saying we've called 12 times, daycare now says they called. You don't have that many investigations that you've shown in the child fatality review report, the preliminary report. They don't match up,
Sure.
right? The calls don't match up to the number of investigations, and none of those investigations were substantiated. So it seems that, Rebecca was trusting her teachers, telling them one thing, but then that wasn't, when DCS went out, that wasn't the same. They didn't get what the call was for substantiated.
Sure.
Where's the disconnect?
So I think there's a couple things. First of all, we don't have a record of the daycare calling, for whatever that's worth. We do have records of the school calling. Some of the calls the school made are alleging things like the children seem hungry, they are showing up dirty, the children are missing school, right? So those are not things that the department was statutorily created to investigate. Educational neglect is not a thing in Arizona, right? It just isn't. So those are not things that meet report criteria for us. There are other things the school called for that did meet report criteria, and we did investigate. But when we're looking at neglect, we have to have that piece of substantial risk of harm to the child, right? Because it's, the legislature has been pretty clear. They want us investigating abuse or neglect, not poverty or, symptoms of poverty, those kind of things. And so we walk kind of a fine line of intruding in a family where we don't need to be versus the school's telling us something is going on with this family, right? That's what they're telling us. But unless it's alleging a substantial risk of harm to the child, we don't have authority to go out as the law stands right now. But I think these are things that the task force, right, is going to be looking at.
What about interviews? Are those happening in front of parents? I know there was a forensic interview in this case at one point. Mm-hmm. Does that need to change, and what are you learning from this?
So interviews should not take place in front of parents. The forensic interview would have been done by law enforcement, and that is also a piece that I think we're interested in learning because we were not involved in that portion of the case. And so I think there are some communication gaps, certainly, that happened here. And it's one of the things that we are going to be talking about and looking into. Our workers are forensically trained, but the Office of Child Welfare Investigations has kind of a higher level of forensic training interview. And because they do the joint investigation protocols with law enforcement, then they're often at child help, they're done in conjunction with law enforcement, so we're not re-traumatizing the children by doing it multiple times.
So to your knowledge, were the parents there when these interviews happened, or can you?
From what I've seen in the case, for sometimes the parents were there, but they were not in the room. I have not seen any, and obviously it's a big case. I have not seen any of the interviews where the parents were in the same room.
Did too much time go on between when the calls were made and the children were interviewed? Are you looking at changes there?
So based on the allegations that come into the hotline, we have different time frames in which we have to see the victim child. So depending on how the allegations are coded at the hotline, if it's a priority 1, we have 2 hours to see the child victim, and then it kind of goes to longer from there. But a priority 3 is only 72 hours. So it's not weeks. It should not be weeks if we can locate the child and the family. Often we interview the child at school because we know where they are, we know when they're going to be there. There were times in this case where we went to the school and the kids were not there. They had been absent from school, so we would interview them at the home. But the ideal place to interview the child usually is at the school, because then you don't have the influence, right, of the parents, listening outside the door.
Is there anything else, what went wrong? Was the caseworker, I think there was a lot of caseworkers involved in this, looking at the history? I mean, or were they just going out on this one call, or are they aware of the history that adds up?
Yeah. So in pre-commencement, which is we get a call, let's say it gets assigned to me as the caseworker, I work with my supervisor, we look through the history, we run a criminal history on the family so we kind of know what we're getting into when we go out there. So the worker should have all of that history, including the screened out intakes, so the ones I'm talking about that didn't rise to the level of a report. The burden, as I said, is high to remove a child from their home. So although they can consider the history, it's sometimes used to offer services as opposed to kind of, state law doesn't allow for you to do like a 3 strikes and you're out type thing. You know what I mean? Like 3 reports equals a removal. It doesn't work that way. You have to have individual grounds each time you go out there. In order to remove a child, you have to either have exigent circumstances, which means I can't walk away without this child being unsafe, or we need a court order to do it. So removal decisions are not made in a vacuum. The worker has to get their supervisor approval in order to do that, and then we have to also get court approval in order to do that.
Many people, including lawmakers, are saying DCS is failing. The system is broken. What do you say to that?
I would say if you look at our history over time, in 2015 we had 19,000 kids in out-of-home care. And some of that was because of a series of high-profile incidents, kind of like what is happening today. And so what you see happen is you have a high-profile incident, and this happens in every state, right? It's not just Arizona. You have a high-profile fatality, changes are made, removals go up. I can tell you right now, removals this month are probably going to go up because the field is hyper-vigilant, right? They're seeing what happened in Rebecca's case, and they're taking an approach where they don't want the next fatality to be right on their case. Nobody wants for that to happen. And so removals are going to go up. We don't want that to happen. What I want is for the worker to be making a safety decision with the family in front of them and making the best decision for them, and not making a fear-based decision. So
what needs to change?
Well, I think that's what our review, I don't think, that is what our review is going to show. So our review is going to show different things that influence decision making. One of the things that I noticed just looking at the cases is some of them were closed kind of quickly. So I don't know why the cases were closed quickly, and that's what our review will show. So I can say to the field, well, you need to keep your cases open longer, or you know what I mean? But I don't know if it was management pressure. I don't know if it was they knew the family and so they felt they could resolve it quickly. That's the thing that these interviews and the debriefings will discover, and then you make the policy change based on that.
Let's talk about Zariah Dodd.
Okay.
What have you learned in Zariah Dodd's case?
So Zariah Dodd is not a case that we could talk about publicly, because what the statute says is the child has to have died due to abuse or neglect by a parent, guardian, or custodian. And as we know from the arrest in that case, that hasn't met criteria for us to release information. I will say on that case, we are still doing our critical incident review, and so we're going to look and see if there are any learning points in that case where we can make changes based on that.
What about, I think the big question there, the big red flag is this was a 16-year-old who was asking for help. You know, she told her caseworker that she was scared into having sex with this 36-year-old man. That's rape. She's 15 years old. Your agency has said you reported that to law enforcement back in April. Forensic interview isn't scheduled until July. No police agency will confirm what happened in those 3 months, why it took so long. But we know she's murdered on the 4th, days before that interview is scheduled.
Yep.
What does that say to you, and are you concerned about that timeline?
I think if you have concerns about the timeline, that's a question for law enforcement. I think we have those same questions. We do have a police report number from when we reported it in April. And that's about what I can say about that.
What have you learned about Emily Pike's case?
So Emily Pike's case, I'll talk a little bit about what happened at the hearing that we had at the legislature, and then we're going to have some follow-up stakeholder meetings related to that. We did have a tribal consultation with some of the tribes, DCS did, to talk about better ways we can communicate. So Emily Pike was in the custody of a tribe. She was not in our custody. So we did not make placement decisions for her. But we did have her in one of our licensed homes. So one of the things that we've talked about with the tribe is ways we can be more open with them when we license the home, but they have a contract with the home. So if we take a licensing action on the home, how can we let them know? If we take a contract action with our children in our custody in the home, how do we let them know? Vice versa, if they take a contract action, do they want to tell us? They don't have to, but if they, better information sharing. We've also made some offers of, we have a placement packet that when we place a child in a home or group home or a foster home that has the history that we know of the child. And so if they want to replicate something like that when they're placing in our homes, so that way the group home has a little bit more background and information about them. So that's really focused a lot on information sharing and how we can collaborate better as far as that goes.
And this is kind of a broad question, not just with Emily Pike, but in all of these instances. Are there any changes you plan to implement immediately?
The steps that we've taken so far are working with our serious critical incident review team to identify the learning points. At the multidisciplinary team meeting that's happening this week, if there's anything that they point out that we think we can change very quickly, we can do that. We do want to wait until we hear from the field and from the staff about the influences behind their decisions. But if the multidisciplinary team came up with something and said, well, this is obvious, you can make a quick change here, that's certainly something we would consider.
It's too soon to say that at this point.
It's too soon to say, yeah. I don't want to make a change that's going to flip in the other direction because we presumed the reasoning behind the decision.
On average, 20 kids a year are dying in DCS custody. Is that acceptable? And what are you doing about it?
Well, no death is acceptable. No tragedy like that is acceptable. If you look at our reports, many of the fatalities are due to natural causes. So we get children who come into our care because either they've been very abused and they have medical needs because of that, or they have some serious medical issues that maybe the parents are unable to help them with. They can come into our care because of that. But any child dying in our custody is not acceptable. And we use systemic learning to make changes to make the reoccurrence less likely, right? So we are one piece of a very big system, and the caseworkers are one person in an incredibly complex system. And so we don't want to use kind of surface level understanding to make changes without making sure that we're holding the entire system accountable.
How much of a struggle is staff retention? Only 15% of your staff have been here for over 5 years.
You used my stat, I was going to use it. So On average, we see our field staff leaving at about 18 months. And so we have taken some steps to try and correct that, like a step increase, pay increase at 18 months to get people to stay. We've tried a number of different things, but the work is hard. And quite frankly, people say, the pay isn't good, but it's not just pay, it's pay for the way they're treated, right? I don't make enough money to do this or to be treated like this. And so I am trying to help rework some of that narrative that these people come to work really hard every day to do good things. And for the vast majority of our workers, thankfully, they're not going to see a fatality on their caseload. But when stuff like this happens, it does impact the workforce, right? It is on our strategic plan. We have about 15% of our staff have been there for 5 or more years. My guess would be a lot of them are here in central office. I know there are some in the field as well. Our goal is to get to 18%, and so there are different levers we are pulling to try and get to that. So we have a shadowing program where the field can come to central office or central office can go to the field so they can learn some other areas. We have a leadership development program. Obviously, if we could pay them more, that would be great. It's not just, the money, 2% pay raise is going to change my life, but it also makes them feel seen and valued, that someone's advocating for them to get more money.
You're the 5th DCS director in 10 years. What does that say to you, and can anyone fix this?
Well, turnover in leadership at child welfare agencies does actually directly impact the work as well. And so I think some of what that says is that the work is really hard, right? People can't stay in this job. I think nationally the average is 18 months. So the fact that directors McKay and Faust each stayed for 4 years is kind of unheard of. But it does impact the field when you have a new person in my seat every couple of months with new priorities, new direction, new, whatever. I think one of the reasons I was selected for the role is because they wanted continuity for the field. They wanted the field and the agency to have someone they know, someone they trust, someone who's not going to come in and start from scratch, but who has been around long enough that I can see what we tried, what has worked, what hasn't worked, and what we can do to kind of move forward in that way.
How important is it to you? You said you take this very seriously. How committed are you to making sure that what happened, what are you doing to make sure this never happens again?
Sure. One of my biggest, I'll call it platforms, when I got the job was responding to child fatalities in a way that creates systemic improvements and doesn't backslide the agency to where we were in 2015. So I talked about it in my confirmation hearing. I talked about it in that interview, that we talked about. There, in my opinion, is a right way to respond to these, and there is a wrong way to respond to these. And so I think we need to be very, very careful in how we're responding so that it doesn't impact the field in the wrong way, so that they're intervening in families when we don't need to be. I am absolutely 100% committed to working with Senator Warner, working with the legislature, working with the governor's office to come up with solutions that will reduce the likelihood of reoccurrence of something like this in the future. That is a top priority of mine.
A lot of people have lost faith in your agency. What do you say to those people?
What I would say to those people is the headlines right now are these, high-profile fatalities that are terrible and sad and tragic. But good things happen at this agency every single day, whether it's sending a child back home to a family that's safer and stronger, whether it's adoption into a loving forever home, whether it's a child who has unfortunately had to age out of care, who now has housing and a stipend and they're going to college. We have a lot of really good things, and our data shows that we do good things every single day. So I would say to look holistically at the system and at the agency and see that this is a portion of the work that we do, but the vast majority of the work that we do is really positive and really good work.
What are you doing to make sure group homes are able to take care of kids with basic medical needs like type 1 diabetes?
we've been meeting with the Arizona Diabetes Association. We've been meeting with Phoenix Children's, who are helping develop guides for our caregivers. So when our group homes take a child who has a medical need, they are telling us that they have the capacity to care for that child's needs. But we want to make sure that we're giving them all the resources that we have. Because sometimes it's a group home, but sometimes it's grandma who's taking their grandchild with type 1 diabetes. And so we need to make sure that she is also equipped to be able to care for the medical needs. We've been meeting with our health plan as well to talk about if there's a way that we can design facilities. I don't want to design a facility for children with diabetes and put all of the children with diabetes in that facility, because that would mean if you were in Kingman, we're moving you down to Phoenix, or you're in Tucson, we're moving you to Phoenix, and we want to keep kids in their communities of origin. But we want to make sure that we have the capacity for children who have medical needs, but also some co-occurring behavioral health needs sometimes as well, that there's a place where they can go where they can be safe both mentally and physically.
Are you concerned that 2 kids with type 1 diabetes died in group homes for very similar reasons? They were allowed to refuse their insulin.
I do find that concerning. I think the answer in each case is different. I would also say that our group homes don't have the authority to strap children down and force them to take their medication. Right, that's right. Not the solution. In the same,
right, but should they call 911? Should they get them to the hospital?
Yes, so yes, but there are other solutions, right, which is taking them to the hospital. And I think, there is litigation in those cases, and I think that's something they're exploring in those as well.
What is the purpose of this task force, and what can we expect to come out of it?
So the purpose of the task force is to do exactly what we've been talking about in this conversation, to look at the case without hindsight bias, right? Because it's easy to look at some of these things and say, well, I wouldn't have made that decision, but it's because we know the outcome. So understanding why the decisions were made, what information might have been helpful to the worker at the time, what other things, if they knew, could have changed the decision they made then. And maybe the answer in some of these cases is nothing. But I think we are going to get some learning certainly out of this case. Then working with the task force to understand, is this a policy change DCS can make? Does it require legislative change? Does it require a pay increase for staff? Does it require more staff? What does that look like? And then proposing the solution, whether it's legislative or internal.
What I'm hearing you say, though, is that change needs to happen. You're not sure exactly what that change is yet.
Sure.
Is that a fair statement?
Yes, I believe changes are going to come out of this review.
How significant should these changes be?
I don't think we have the answer to that yet. It may require legislative change. It may just be internal policy change. But I can tell you, no one is more motivated to reduce the reoccurrence of this happening than the department, obviously.
From the outside looking in, I think people look at how did they not do more, right? We have all these calls. I mean, I know this isn't a simple one-worded answer, but what do you want to say to people who just can't, even the schools, like how did they not, we did everything we could. We were trying to sound the alarm. What do you want to say to the people who feel like DCS could have and should have done more to protect Rebecca Baptiste?
I think what I want to say to them is that we are taking this very seriously. We are working through the process with our third-party contractor who works in multiple jurisdictions. We're working with the National Partnerships for Child Safety who work in, I believe, 35 jurisdictions. We want to do this in the way that we know is best practice, in the way that is going to get us actual answers, not just a quick fix to make people feel better. We want to fix it in the right way. And that we are going to be as open and transparent about the changes we're making as we possibly can.
There have been a lot of audits. Those audits have found a lot of problems. Why have so many of those gone unfixed?
That's a complicated question. So there are a couple answers to that. Some of the findings in the audit recommendations we have not agreed with. So we have basically from the start said, we don't agree with your finding. We think it's wrong. And so we are not going to comply. Sometimes the audit findings are worded in a way that is difficult to comply with. So, for example, an audit finding will say the department needs to have quality court reports. So we may believe we've improved our court reports and are complying with that audit, but quality isn't defined, so it's difficult to comply with. Some of them are not complied with because when you have 175 findings, over the course of 10 years, it takes some time, right, to come into compliance with them, because compliance isn't, you can't just change the policy, it's complied with. Some are, but not all. But we are working very closely with our partners at the Auditor General's Office to the extent that we can implement them quickly and show proof that we have implemented them.
Are you trying to work on that in your new role as director? Is that a priority for you?
I'm briefed on the audit status once a month by our audit team, and they're working, across the agency to make sure we get these done. We're the only agency in the state that has a mandatory audit every year, so as we wrap a couple up, we're going to get a couple more at the same time. And so it's kind of a churn, but yes, that is something that I'm working closely with our audit team on.
Is it fair to say mistakes were made in Rebecca Baptiste's case? You're trying to figure out what they were and how you could have done better?
I think that's an oversimplification of what happened. I think you can look at it backwards facing because we know the outcome and we can say, well, that decision was a mistake. We know the decisions made sense at the time, so I need to understand what was influencing the decisions when they made them. I wish the outcome were different, but to place blame on an individual, like a caseworker or even a unit of the office, when we know the system is so complex, and you've seen some of the file, so many people touched this case that it's an oversimplification to just say, well, you made a mistake, and so that's the end of the story.
Is that a part of this issue, is that so many people did touch the case, and were they all aware of the history to your knowledge, or do you know that yet?
I will say that's not something that stood out to me in the case, but it's something that we'll explore through the review.
What stood out to you the most in kind of layman's terms to explain it home so far in that case where we could see possible change or improvement?
Well, I don't want to influence the debriefing that's going on, but I will say the two things I think that I mentioned are the questions that I would like to have further learning on, which are how we code things, criminal conduct or not, at the hotline, and without placing blame on anybody because they're using a tool that's been designed. Does the tool need updated? Does the tool need revamping? And then I think also looking at the time frame in which some of the cases were closed, and if management or whoever, up to my level was putting pressure on the field to close cases quickly, and that influenced closing cases quickly. I can't tell you if either of those things would have changed the outcome in this case. I don't think anybody can, but there are things that I think we should be digging into a little further.
What about when the family moved? I think you didn't know that. You were trying to figure out where the family is. On the surface level, I think people hear that and go, that's a really big red flag. They're not at school. They go to the middle of nowhere. They're in yurts, and things get obviously much worse.
Sure.
Where does the department's authority come in there? Could you have done more to find the family? School says they kind of knew where the family was. Were those conversations being had?
So that you bring up a really interesting point that we see not just in this case but in other cases, which is that families move to get away from prying eyes, right? They move to get away from mandatory reporters. They move to get away from us, maybe from law enforcement. We have tools we can use to find the families, but if they don't register a forwarding address, like I assume these people did not, we don't have an air tag or something on them where we can always go find the family. So we do have some tools. We work with law enforcement. We work with different systems to try and locate them. The other point that you bring up, though, is that engaging with us is voluntary. So if we knock on a door and the family chooses not to answer or chooses not to engage with us, they're not sending the children to school, that's the end of our authority. We can't force somebody out and force them to tell us what's going on in the home. And so I think we see a little bit of that too in the case. The family would cooperate sometimes would not cooperate, and then we're kind of left with the end of our authority.
Couple last questions. What is the difference between this stakeholder meeting, this task force? What can we expect from all of those? And you know, I think there's been some frustration that the stakeholder meeting, this one isn't open to the public.
So Senator Warner is leading the charge on those. The stakeholder meeting, I think initially was meant to be a follow-up to the Emily Pike hearing, and to talk about what came out of the hearing, what next steps can be taken. Given the additional high-profile incidents in the meantime, they wanted to kind of add it on and make it a holistic thing. As far as the task force, I think you'd have to, I don't know.
Okay, I just was like, there's a lot, you know.
I think the task force is
more
going to
like
be
maybe legislative changes, policy changes.
Well, we have there's the DCS Oversight Committee at the legislature, and so I think the task force will be under that, but you'd have to ask her.
How could the legislature help
Yeah, okay.
DCS?
Well, I'd start by saying Senator Champ ran a bill a couple years ago which codifies this serious critical incident review process that I've talked about, which we are grateful to have that in statute, and any member of the public or anyone can look and see exactly what the steps are that we're going to take and that we're taking as related to this. So that was very helpful. She added the outside members to the team, and that was helpful. I think what would be helpful from the legislature is to stay engaged with us as we work through that process, and then allow us to present some of the learning that we get from that. I know it's easy to draw a quick conclusion and want to make change based on that, but this process has been shown to be best practice nationally. This is how you safely reform child welfare agencies, safe system improvement. And so working collaboratively with the department as we go through that process is the best thing the legislature can do. Our hotline does have a quality review process. So every single call that is screened out is reviewed again by somebody else. So the second person will listen to the hotline call, and if they disagree and think it meets report criteria, they can flip the report and then make it a report for investigation. So we do have a secondary review of every single one of those calls.
How would you describe these 3 high-profile cases?
Yeah. I mean, every person who comes to work for this agency, whether you are on the administrative side, if you are in the field, does it because we care about kids, right? We want children to be safe. We want them to be in loving families. And so when you see a child who is known to us who is murdered, it's very, very hard on the department, and it's hard on the workforce. And no one comes to work here wanting something like this to happen, right? And so every decision that they're making is made not wanting something like this to happen. So that's why, looking at it with the hindsight bias, I can say, oh, well, I wouldn't have made that decision. But clearly they weren't making the decision with the hopes that this would be the outcome. So that's what we need to understand, what was influencing their decision making, and then we can make changes from there.
Personally, how would you describe these cases?
I mean, they keep me up at night. I haven't slept in a while, and it's not about me, that's not the point, but you know, these are devastating. I'm a mother, as I've talked about, and so you know, they're unimaginable.
What are you doing to make sure they never happen again?
We're working through our process, and we are making sure that the changes we make are addressing the root cause of why the decisions were made.
Everyone we've talked to still says you're the person for this job.
Oh, that's good.
Why do you think you are the person for this job?
I think I've been in the space long enough that, as I said, I've seen what happens when you react too quickly. You react, you know, by maybe firing a bunch of people and then saying you fixed the problem. I think the field knows me. I've been around working with them, I started as a line level assistant attorney general, and I worked my way up. So I've seen kind of all areas of the organization. I was a foster parent and I adopted out of foster care, and so I have that lived experience piece as well. So I think, I can see kind of from a lot of different angles what's going on, and I have good partnerships, thankfully, at the legislature with, Senator Warner and others who are working to address this issue, and I think, I hope that's why. I am optimistic, and I'm optimistic because we are committed to safely improving the system. I have a fantastic team. Without that team, we wouldn't be able to do any of this work. They are committed to the same things of getting to the root causes of why these things happened. They care about children. They are here because they care about children. And I think if there's a solution to be had, that we are going to find it, and we're going to make that change. This is a completely different agency from when I started. So I actually was just saying to somebody, I have a totally different job than Director McKay or Director Faust had, because the agency was on fire at that time. And our staff were going into a home, they had 5 minutes with the family because they had 80 kids on their caseload, and they were just pulling kids. And I'm not assigning blame or judgment or whatever. That was the fact. That's the facts of how we were working then. Through our quality improvement process, through using our guided decision-making tool that I talked about, we are making significantly better safety decisions today than we were when I started. And that's something that the agency should be really proud of.
And because you were with the Attorney General's office and you were the attorney for DCS, and then you came over as general counsel here, correct?
I was at the Attorney General's office when it was DES,
Okay.
and it was CPS was part of it.
Okay.
And then they split, and then I came in-house as deputy general counsel.
Okay.
And I was our legislative liaison.
Okay.
And then I left for a little bit. I went to Casey Family Programs, which is a national nonprofit.
Learned about that from Dr. Cole. Yeah.
Focused on
who funds
yes,
the,
yes. And then I came back as general counsel 2 years ago.
Okay. So you're no stranger to this agency.
I am no stranger to this agency.
Well, I really appreciate you taking the time
Of course.
and having the conversation. How quickly do you think? I mean, I know these things take time.
Yeah.
And, session. We're not in
Yeah.
session and all of that, but.
Ordinarily, our reviews take about 90 days,
Okay.
given everything going on with this one. We've asked them to do it in about 60. I
Okay.
will say this process involves debriefing the staff who worked on the case. And we want to be mindful of the fact that they are, some of them, having a very hard time right now.
Oh, I imagine.
And we need them to be open and honest and feel safe to communicate with us about what happened. And not everyone is there yet. So we're balancing, right? Getting the information with also respecting staff, because if they quit, we don't learn anything from them, right? And so we need them feeling safe and supported as well.